think I'm audible, which is great. So, so having had some skepticism about the value of machine learning technologies put in the room, which is always good, we are one of those companies that tries to do this stuff. So I'm going to talk to you about what we do and how we do it. And in doing that, I'll try to make the case for the value of things like unsupervised machine learning and why we think it's useful. And it's twofold, basically, why it's useful. One is there's an argument for why you need it for detection, but the other part, which isn't talked about so much, is the argument for why it's useful for responding, for automatic response to stuff. So that's what I'm going to talk about, how we try to use machine learning to take action and do stuff and remediate threats, active machine learning. And so a good example of that, to understand it, is how you might want something like a machine learning solution to help you with ransomware and the kind of stuff that we saw with WannaCry. And so since that happened and we were deployed and that was a good trial of the way we work, I'll talk to you guys about that a bit. But let me very briefly, if people haven't heard of Darktrace, we're about 4 years old. We are based in Cambridge and San Francisco primarily, but also London and a bunch of other offices. We come from this maths, machine learning background, started in the University of Cambridge, and we basically are a threat detection company. We make software and we provide services around it to try to use some of these AI innovations with security teams and SOCs to help them get some value. There's a little picture about us. We call what we do immune system technology, which is, I'll explain why we call it that in a second. But it's a way to think about the value of anomaly detection. We've got about 3,000 deployments now, 70 different countries, so it's been quite a fun few years. All right, so that's some logos. So let me talk to you a little bit about what we do, and what the argument we think, what the argument is for the use of things like unsupervised machine learning. So a very natural way to approach security is what you might call a intelligence-driven approach, right? And so the idea is you want to protect something, and so a natural way to go about thinking about how to do that is to go and look at what you're trying to protect it against, and that means gathering information about the threat landscape, and what attackers are out there, and what they're trying to do, and what tools they use, and what motivates them, and how they operate when they get inside networks. Right? It makes sense, right, to first understand the challenge you're up against, and then you can design a security strategy in response to that. And that kind of works, but we think, or we're concerned that it's getting increasingly less valuable, the kind of operational value of this intelligence, whether it's low-level, tactical stuff, or even high-level strategic stuff, because the value of intelligence is predicated on the similarity that attacks bear to previous and other attacks, right? So this is only useful if the threat landscape is simple enough and static enough that you can get a feel for it and understand it and analyze it and then make meaningful decisions and say with any likelihood of predictability what the threat will look like, how they'll break into your network, what you can expect them to do. But as threats get more and more distinct each time and novelty becomes more and more prevalent, that gets less valuable, right, as a way to approach detection. And the kind of explosion in novelty of threats is not new to people. There's exponential rises in malware families, there's lots of reasons for this, there's some changing economies of scale, there's lower barriers to entry with tooling, lots of different motivations behind attack groups now. So we look at the threat landscape and we envisage a situation where going forwards there will be no guarantee that you can expect how you're attacked to bear significant resemblance to previous attacks. So that's the case that we think really motivates the need for a layer of something like an unsupervised machine learning layer, because the idea there, and this is why we call it an immune system approach, is an analogy with the human body, right? Because this is the way that organisms have evolved to deal with the novelty of threat, because organisms face new threats all the time, and part of the way they do that is with the innate immune system, and what the innate immune system does is it knows self, right? So the idea is, if you lose visibility and information about what the external threat landscape looks like, you replace that with great visibility and knowledge about your own environment. Right? So you build up an understanding of self, right? And that means having a conceptual awareness of what normal looks like, and against that being able to recognize not self or attack. And so for a network or an organization, that's a behavioral notion of self, right? Which is why behavioral analysis is proving valuable for people, because the idea is if you want to understand self for an organization, self is people and process and day-to-day activities. So you understand what day-to-day normal looks like, and then against that comparison set, you can spot intrusion and compromise by the symptomatic effects of the deviations. Right? So it's, in many ways, a slightly pessimistic or a more mature approach, which is accepting the inevitability of compromise and then saying, when your intelligence fails you and you do get compromised, what do you do about it? You try to leverage a rich understanding of what your network looks like and what's normal for your organization to spot the things against it that stand out. Right? So that's the idea. So that's what we try to do. This is the technology that we have. It's basically a detection engine with a sort of investigation platform wrapped around it, and the idea is to do this stuff, to model and learn an organization. And you can't just do simplistic old school baselining. For this to work and be useful, there's a couple of things you need for it to be valuable to SOCs. One is that you need contextual understanding of the whole network. So what I mean by that is, a really important part of doing this is doing clustering, kind of mapping network topology. So what you have to do is, you have to, in an organization, there are points of commonality. Right? So people in, say, the HR team do similar kinds of things. Their business role requires it. Whereas, say, sysadmins do different kinds of things that their business role requires. And that's borne out on the network, right? So they have a different kind of footprint on the network, and so you need to identify these patterns and these peer groups and these natural groupings inside an organization and network, because that's your comparison basis, right? Because if you just look at entities on their own, individual people or machines, every time they do something new or different, you're going to freak out and go, well, that's totally different, I've never done that before. So to understand whether something's concerning or not, you need to put it in the context of the group, so that if you see, say, someone who's a sysadmin who's never connected to this machine before, but there is context for that person's peer group using PowerShell or, I don't know, PSExec or something internally in the network, then that's far less concerning than if someone in sales or HR does it, and there's no behavioral context for them. And that's really key for the next part of this, which is how we think we need to think about using machine learning to respond to stuff. I won't chat too much about this stuff. All right, so this is the next part of it. So this is the interesting bit when it comes to ransomware, which is you can make self-learning networks to some extent, right? Well, that's the idea, right? You can have a layer of machine learning that watches an organization and builds up a rich understanding of what each person, each device does and what self looks like for that organization. And then you can find deviations and changes and you can tell a person about it, right? So you can throw these in front of a security team, and the challenge there is kind of engineering and operational challenges of how do you present this stuff to a SOC well? How do you package up the output of machine learning analytics in a way that's useful to analysts on the front line, right? How do you integrate with their other tools? So that's one side of it. But there's a strong case to be made for proactive autonomous response when you can do it, right? So automatically responding to stuff has got a bad sort of reputation with good reason, right? And that's because traditional attempts to automatically remediate threats tended to be far too crude in one of two ways. And the reason that was happening was that they were detecting compromise based off rules or signatures or intelligence, right? So the idea here is this. Rules or signatures may allow you to detect a threat really well, but they don't tell you anything about what you should do when you detect the threat, right? They're not prescriptive. So there's nothing in a detection methodology that uses intelligence to tell you what to do automatically in any straightforward way. So let's say you have some kind of snort SIG and it fires on a connection that says, we're matching a particular thing this device is doing. It's connecting to this IP on this port, and we think that's an indicator of badness. We think this machine is compromised. If you want to automatically do something about that, you kind of have two choices, right? You either, on one extreme, put some kind of automatic firewall rule in place to block just specifically the thing that the rule matched upon, which would be, connections to this IP and this port. On the other extreme, you can take a sledgehammer to it and you can just automatically knock the device off the network entirely. And both extremes are kind of useless, right? Because one is far too brittle and fragile, and as soon as the attack changes even slightly, then you've got around what you've just done automatically, so that's kind of useless. The other has such huge sort of costs in terms of impact on business productivity if it's a false positive, or even if it's not a false positive, that it's not reliably doable or even feasible to knock machines off the network often, but that's a no-go, right? So both the extremes didn't work, which is why you needed a human to smartly figure out how to respond to a threat. That makes sense. But there is room here for these kinds of machine learning tools to help us automatically respond to stuff. And the idea is this. If you're trying to understand what normal and self looks like for an organization, and against that you're detecting deviations and outliers as potential threats, then you have inbuilt into that the prescription of what a remedy might look like automatically. And that's just enforce the normal pattern of behavior. Right? So the idea is this: if you have a device or a person, and you've learned what they do all the time, and then you see them doing something that looks really unexpected based on what they and their peer group and the whole organization does, and you want to do something about that, well, a natural thing to do is to leverage that understanding that you used to draw your attention to this in the first place and deploy it operationally to do something about it. So what that means is you can use that understanding to selectively kill and terminate behaviors that are suspicious, but leave the ones that look benign and totally in accordance with normal behavior untouched, right? So this opens the door to you doing a kind of intelligent, smart quarantine somewhere in between. So if someone is compromised or doing something that looks suspicious, you don't take them offline entirely. What you do is you temporarily restrict novelty, right? So you can imagine it like this. Here's a person, and they're allowed to deviate from what they've done before a bit. They can stray a bit outside of their pattern of life. But if they get too far and it starts to look suspicious, then you start to clamp down on it. And you say, okay, for now, we're a bit worried about you. So you can keep talking to this application server in these data quantities on this protocol during these times, because we've seen you do that a lot, and we've seen your peers do that a lot. And that doesn't look worrying. That looks like part of your business. But you don't suddenly now get to start using SSH if you've never done it before. Or you don't suddenly get to start connecting to new external IPs. So you temporarily restrict this person's ability to do novel stuff, and then you can make that tighter and tighter until you clamp down entirely and say, no, you can only do the stuff we've seen really, thoroughly seen that from you and everyone else. And so this is how we think organizations should think about layering in some kind of intelligent machine learning based response, because this is how it can work with security teams, right? Because this can't analyze complex threats for you, and you need humans to investigate them. But what you can do is you can buy time for teams by starting to cut down on some of the really egregious looking outliers temporarily while someone looks at it, and then hopefully you'll stop the network being burned down in the meantime. That's the idea. Right? So the example that was on the front of this, there's two, that's confusing. This one. WannaCry was not at all subtle. So from a behavioral point of view, that was super easy to see. Right? That's one hell of a deviation from normal. The challenge was things like detecting it by a threat vector method doesn't always work, because you get novelty, new strains of malware, and so things can get compromised. But if you look at the symptomatic changes on the network, it's not a hard problem to solve. The kind of fundamental idea here is something like this. If you want to cause an impact to an organization, you have to make something happen that wouldn't have happened if you hadn't been there. It wouldn't have happened otherwise. If you compromise a machine or a person and you just do their job for them, then who cares, right? It's got no impact on the business. It's not going to cause any damage. So there's a strong coupling between the extent of potential impact and the extent of deviation from normal behavior, right? And as far as we can tell, that's a fundamental principle. I don't know of any way that you can cause an impact in the business, but in the course of doing that, not make it do something that it wouldn't normally do. And that's why ransomware is kind of so damaging, because it causes such a big deviation from what would normally happen in the organization. But that's precisely why it's so easy to detect, really. So the idea is something like this. You have devices, and you learn what they typically do, and you have people with laptops, Windows machines, and in the course of doing their job, they will talk to lots of external endpoints, and they'll talk to lots of internal servers, and they'll have a pattern of life, and you learn that, and then in the course of someone getting compromised with ransomware, you get a series of deviations, right? And so you can think kill chainy if you like, but the idea is multiple weak indicators correlating together, right? So when a client device gets compromised from a client-side attack, you get some initial deviations. Maybe it's a web drive-by attack or malvertising or something, and so they get redirected externally and they get served some unusual content types like octet streams, some rare destinations for the environment. That looks unusual, right? Compared to what their peer group does, that looks like something that doesn't normally happen while this person's just browsing their typical websites and going through a normal path on the internet. So that's unusual, that stands out, right? And then when they get infected, like all malware, you have command and control, so you start to get beaconing activities. That's a change in this device's external connectivity pattern. That looks weird. And you start to add these up. And then the big flashing red light for something like ransomware are when it starts trying to encrypt network shares internally, right? And this is the dangerous part, because this is where they can start to affect the crown jewels and stuff, depending on your sort of, I guess, security model and your security strategy. Hopefully there isn't that much at risk on individual employees' client devices. It's, the assets on file servers that you're worried about. So when it starts trying to encrypt those, then you get massive flurries of SMB activity that look super anomalous, right? And this is what I would show you if I could do a demo, but if you want, we can show you it afterwards. But the idea is this: you watch what this device does and you learn, and then you suddenly see it bombarding file shares with, insane quantities of SMB reads and writes, way outside of what it normally does. And maybe it normally talks to these servers a bit, but not in that quantity, not in that way. And there's no way that that looks normal for this device. So what you do is you just start cutting the connections that look weird. So you start terminating or throttling its connections to the file server, but you let it do everything else. And so hopefully if you do it right, the employee doesn't even know that anything's happening. They keep using their device, they can do their job, and the big sort of terrible potential impact of the ransomware gets mitigated by sort of putting out the massive fire of it encrypting all the shares on this database, right? So that's the idea, and it was much worse with WannaCry, right? So we worked with NHS Trust that got hit with WannaCry, and we were luckily able to stop this for them, because with WannaCry, it's not just encrypting shares, but it's trying to aggressively spread internally and externally, right? And very, very few devices ever attempt normally in the course of their life to scan the internet on port 445. You'd hope they wouldn't, right? So that's pretty easy to see that that's unusual, right? And you might think, okay, you don't need machine learning to do that. You could figure out in advance that you wouldn't want your machine to do that, and if it does, that might be bad. But it's a standard kind of, argument of it's impossible to list all the things that might happen. Is if you say to someone, hey, look, one of your machines is scanning the internet on port 445, lots of them are. Anyone who's a semi-decent analyst can tell you that doesn't look right and that's not okay. But you don't necessarily have that in your list of things to expect, because there's an infinite number of these things. So you need to have this is the whole argument behind things like unsupervised machine learning, in that they're not pre-limited in that sense, so that they complement your threat modeling and your existing use cases of what you think is going to happen. By when something out of the box happens that's not at all subtle, but it just wasn't something you're looking for, then it's really easy for these tools to come in and go, well, obviously stop that, right? So that's the idea. What else do I have? I have a conclusion slide. I will say a little bit more about other kinds of threats. Is it in here? No, it's not. These have changed. So, a nice thing about this approach is that it's not particularly malware-centric. And I've been talking about ransomware, so that's kind of giving it a malware slant. But there's kind of a myopic view with a lot of security vendors about fixation on malware, right? And analyzing content. And that's fine, but it starts to give you this sort of, if you have a hammer, everything's a nail, where you start to think about cybersecurity in terms of malware. And we all know it's far bigger than that. And so what's nice about a kind of approach that is purely behavioral and looks at changes in the organization is it opens you up to a far broader understanding of what suspicious might be. Right? So what we find with our customers is that we get a lot of value in HR teams and other parts of the business who are interested generally in understanding that an employee is doing something unusual, whether or not it's strictly speaking threatening from an InfoSec point of view, right? And this is really important if we want to talk at the risk level about this stuff, because people often say to me when I talk to them about dark trace, they say, what about benign anomalies? I mean, what do you mean? They go, well, there's this guy in the company, and for the course of their business, they have to do things that are a bit different to everyone else, so they're going to look like an outlier and they're going to do stuff that no one else does, but it's not going to be a problem. We don't want to be told about that. Isn't that a challenge for an anomaly-based solution? And I don't think it's a challenge, right? I don't see why you wouldn't want to know about that, right? It's a very, very narrow understanding of what security means, to think that you only want to know about things that fit into your understanding of this is a threat to us. It's interesting from an organizational point of view if someone is different. Why are they different? Why are they doing that? Are they behaving in a way that exposes the organization to risk because they're not conforming with the expected behavior that your security strategy has been built around? So this kind of understanding is very, very valuable, and hopefully it starts to move strategic conversations up to the architectural level and kind of the process level, and away from the putting out fires levels in the SOC, right? And so this is another great argument, we think, for trying to come up with a way to layer in autonomous response alongside human-driven investigations, because it frees up your humans to do the creative stuff, right? Which is thinking about use cases and threat hunting and iteratively refining SOC playbooks and thinking about re-architecting the network. And that sort of stuff cannot be done by a machine, at least not in the foreseeable. So let's try as much as possible to let the machines do the bits that they can do when they can help us, and then let's leave humans to not run around putting out fires, but try to be creatively improving this security posture of the organization, rather than just operationally maintaining it all the time. All right, I think that's enough for me. Thank you.